Okay, so I am going to be covering the clinical studies in humans to support my notion that eating a diet high in animal protein absolutely increases the propensity for negative calcium balance. So, this was a study published in 1930 by Walter McClellan. This was on Dr. Stefansson, who had spent 11 years in the Arctic exploring, and also Anderson, who was a member of one of the expeditions. So, observations have been made on two men who lived on meat alone for 1 year. Meat, as it was used in these studies, included the edible portions of the animal body. The term is understood by many to refer only to lean muscle, and they think of a meat diet as a high protein. The foods consumed by the men, however, who for the most part ate the proportions of lean and fat meat which they desired, was moderately high in protein, high in fat, and very low in carbohydrate. They're probably taking this to mean glycogen in the animal foods. This was 1930, so I don't think they really understood that glycogen degrades very quickly post-mortem. The opportunity to observe the effects of this diet occurred when Dr. Stefansson and Mr. Anderson, who had lived on this type of food while carrying on explorations in the regions near the Arctic Ocean, volunteered to take meat exclusively for 1 year while they continued their usual activities in New York. So, Stefansson had spent 11 years in the Arctic exploring, according to him, 9 of which he lived almost exclusively on a meat diet. No one's saying you cannot live exclusively on a meat diet. My proposition is that it increases the propensity for negative calcium balance. And there are things that you can do to reduce that risk, like consuming some type of base or consuming more calcium. However, there are still, in my opinion, potential harms, even if you increase your calcium intake high enough to go into positive balance, from not offsetting a high acid load diet, aka a high animal protein diet, with some type of base. But let's continue on. Okay, so the protocol. Dr. Stefansson, who had accustomed himself to the exclusive use of meat during his long journeys of exploration, was 48 years of age, in good physical condition, had a blood pressure of 105/70. After a preliminary period on a mixed diet, he began taking meat exclusively on February 28, 1928, and continued it for 375 days to March 8, 1929, after which he took a mixed diet for 2 weeks. At the beginning, he received only lean meat in order to reach a high level of protein metabolism. At the end of the second day, an attack of nausea and diarrhea developed, which subsided after 2 days, during which he ate more fat and less lean. He had 2 other mild digestive disturbances and 2 light attacks of pharyngitis. I mean, go figure, after a year, you're going to get colds and you're going to have some inflammation of the pharynx. The second subject, Mr. Anderson, had accompanied Stefansson on one of his Arctic expeditions. He was 38, Danish by birth, small in stature, excellent physical condition, blood pressure 140/80. He started eating meat January 24th, 1928, after taking mixed diets for 3 weeks, and continued it until January 24th, 1929, in all 367 days. Aside from 2 short attacks of pharyngitis, his year was without particular incident. Okay. What did they eat? The men took beef, lamb, veal, pork, and chicken in the course of their year on the diet. The portions of the animal used included muscle, liver, kidney, brain, bone marrow, bacon, and fat. Except for short periods of special observation, the men chose the kind of meat which they desired and ate as much as they wished of the lean and the fat. Stefansson, for 31 days, took an average of 1.8 pounds of meat per day. Anderson, for 110 days, averaged 1.7 pounds daily. They took approximately 0.6 kilograms of lean meat made up of muscle and gland tissues and 0.2 kilograms of fat from body fat and bone marrow. All right. So this is how much they consumed. The energy value was somewhere between 2,000 and 3,100 calories, of which 15 to 25% was protein, 75 to 85 fat, 1 to 2% carb. The men received approximately 500 calories per day from protein, and they said 20 to 50 carb, which probably not, because they're thinking of glycogen, and about 2,000 calories from fat. So this would be about 125 grams of protein, 222 grams of fat. So complete carnivore diet, moderately high in protein, high in fat for 1 year. Okay, so this was Anderson's data. This box is when he was on the all-meat diet, and this is the calcium balance during those periods. So this is period 2 to period 12, and this is how many days on each period, which there were 10 days apiece. And wouldn't you know, calcium balance was negative every single time. This is 11 periods of 10 days. That's 110 days of negative calcium balance, no end in sight. However, I will say that the negative calcium balance is slowly decreasing. It's still even after 100 days of consuming an all-meat diet, Anderson was still losing about 175 milligrams of calcium every single day, but it was decreasing. So maybe the body does slowly shut off calcium loss. However, the total amount of calcium that was lost was 34,500 milligrams, which is about, we have a ton of calcium in our body, about anywhere from 1.2 to 1.4 million milligrams. Most of that, 99% of that in bone. So they lost about 2.65% of their total calcium in 117 days. That it was measured. Okay, this was a mixed diet day 1. This was a lower protein, and then he went back on a mixed diet during this period. So all this proves is that since 1930, we have known that consuming an all-meat diet, a carnivore diet, leads to negative calcium balance. We've known that since the Stefansson-Anderson publication. Here is the calcium balances for Stefansson on the all-meat diet. It was, no shocker, negative calcium balance for the entire period that he was on the all-meat diet, at least for these days and these study periods that they measured calcium for. Okay, so this was a 15,000 milligram negative calcium deficit for these periods in the 60 days that they had measurements for. On average, this was a negative 254.6 milligrams of calcium per day. Okay, so I'm going to go through many other clinical studies proving that a high animal protein, a high carnivorous diet can cause negative calcium balance and increases the propensity. It may not always cause a negative calcium balance, but in many studies it does. So it does increase the propensity. I don't think anyone could really argue that. Okay, so this is just talking about how much basically protein you would have to get, 800 grams of protein to supply the body's daily need of calcium. They were saying that studies have shown you need about 450 milligrams of calcium at least. They stated a meat diet contains an excess of acid-forming elements. The effect of an acid diet on the excretion of calcium has been reviewed by others. Others have reported that an acid diet increases the calcium excretion and that the increase occurs principally in the urine. Okay, we know that. Calcium balance, this is then them kind of reviewing what I just showed you. Both men had definitive negative balances throughout the periods of meat ingestion for calcium. It was also noted that both the calcium excreted in the urine and the total output were greater than the amounts excreted when they were receiving mixed diets. This may have been due to the acid nature of the diet. No shocker there. And this is showing that the average calcium intake was 100 milligrams on this all-meat diet, but they were excreting on average somewhere between 300 and 500 milligrams, hence the negative calcium balance. Okay, so Stefansson, the 1-year meat diet study clearly proves that if you're on an all-meat diet, it can lead to negative calcium balance. That being said, they were only consuming 100 milligrams of calcium. Okay, so it may depend on how much calcium you're getting in the diet. So something that increases the propensity doesn't mean that it will 100% cause it. And this study actually is a good one showing you that eating a high animal protein diet didn't induce a negative calcium balance, but it but I'm going to show you that it does indicate you do have to consume a very high amount of calcium to prevent the negative calcium balance. And there were still other harms that were shown. So this was in 10 healthy participants in a metabolic study. Subjects initially consumed their non-weight reducing diet, and then they consumed a carb-restricted diet for 2 weeks, followed by another carb-restricted diet for 4 weeks that was high in animal protein. The urine pH decreased from 6.09 to 5.56 and 5.57 in the induction and maintenance. Net acid excretion increased by 56 milliequivalents per day in the induction and 56 and 51 respectively, from a baseline of 61 in the induction and maintenance respectively. Urinary citrate decreased. Urinary saturation of undissociated uric acid increased more than twofold, which may potentially increase the risk of uric acid kidney stones. Urinary calcium levels increased from 160 milligrams per day to 258 milligrams per day and 248 milligrams per day in the maintenance and the initiation and maintenance periods respectively. So showing you that a high animal protein diet significantly increases urinary calcium. This increase in urinary calcium was not compensated for by an increase in fractional intestinal calcium absorption. Therefore, the estimated calcium balance did decrease by 130 milligrams per day and 90 milligrams per day in the induction and maintenance, respectively. Things like basically bone resorption markers, urinary this is a hard word to say, pyridinoline and N-telepeptide trended up, whereas serum osteocalcin concentrations significantly decreased, which is a marker of bone formation. So markers of bone resorption, these two markers trended upwards. It wasn't statistically significant, so we can't say for sure, but the marker for bone formation, osteocalcin, did significantly decrease. So they said that the consumption of a low-carb, high-protein diet for 6 weeks delivers a marked acid load to the kidney, increases the risk of kidney stone formation, decreases estimated calcium balance. They were still in positive balance, though, and may increase the risk of bone loss. But I'm going to show you why they were still in balance. It's because they were consuming over 800 milligrams of calcium. And they were also, the reason probably why they reached that amount is they were given a daily multivitamin. So yes, if you're a carnivore, given a daily multivitamin, which undoubtedly had vitamin D in it, which improves calcium absorption and probably had calcium as well. They didn't specifically state, but most multivitamins back, this study was published in 2002, likely have vitamin D and calcium, hence the very high intakes in this low-carb, high-protein diet. Yes, you may not go in negative calcium balance. If you're consuming over 800 milligrams of calcium and you're consuming a multivitamin, which likely contains vitamin D, which increases the absorption of calcium, you may not go in negative balance. But it still is increasing the propensity by significantly increasing the urinary calcium level by about 100 milligrams a day. So here was the protein intake, which went from 91 grams to 164 and 170. So this was a high protein diet. This is what you're looking for. And the carb intake was very low, 19 grams in the induction and 33 grams in the maintenance. So the induction was a little less carbohydrate than the maintenance, which is potentially why there was a little bit less excretion of calcium. Hard to say, but the excretion was still high in both. 258 milligrams in the induction, 248 milligrams in the maintenance versus 160. So significant increase. Here you can see urinary pH did go down. Urinary ammonium increases. That's how we eliminate acid out the urine. And net acid excretion increased to just over 100 milliequivalents. And urinary citrate went down. Relative saturation ratio for oxalate increased, and undissociated uric acid significantly increased. Okay, here's the significant increase in urinary calcium. Again, increasing the propensity for negative calcium balance. That cannot be argued. It was only offset because they were taking a multivitamin and getting over 800 milligrams of calcium per day. So if you are on a carnivore diet, I think it's safe to assume, since they were in about 150 milligram calcium balance, that you want to consume at least 650 milligrams of calcium on a carnivore. I'm going to show you studies after this that show that you need actually substantially more than that, although you may not. It depends on obviously the population that's being studied, but in these healthy individuals, they only needed 650. Some people may actually need 1,200 milligrams of calcium, however, per day to remain in positive balance on a high animal protein diet. So if you're on a carnivore diet, you likely want to consume it somewhere around 16 ounces of milk or 3 slices of cheddar cheese or a mixture of the two to give you about 600 milligrams of calcium, because then you'll get about another 81 milligrams of calcium from consuming 1.5 pounds of meat, which is what most people do consume on the animal-based or carnivore diet, is around 1.5 pounds, maybe 2 pounds of meat per day. Okay. The authors noted, although not statistically significant, bone resorption markers did trend upwards, and serum osteocalcin levels declined significantly. Results of this study are supportive of previous in vitro experiments showing chronic metabolic acidosis enhances bone resorption and diminishes bone formation. So even if you are in calcium balance, this study is suggesting that bone breakdown is increasing via the trend upwards of bone resorption, and that there's decreases in bone formation by the significant reduction in osteocalcin. So even if you are in a positive calcium balance, there still seems to be negative effects on increasing bone resorption and decreasing bone formation on high acid load diets. Okay, here is another study by Nancy Adams et al., published in 1979, the calciuria of increased fixed acid production in humans. Their diets were over 900 milligrams of calcium. So this was paired balance studies were carried out in 7 healthy adult volunteers in the Medical College of Wisconsin Clinical Research Center. Subjects 1, 2, and 3 got ammonium chloride as their acid load. Subjects 4, 5, 6, and 7, which were 2 women and 2 men, were studied on 2 occasions in random order while eating a liquid formula diet in which egg whites were served as the protein source, at a protein intake of the low protein diet of 0.4 grams per kilogram per day, and at a protein intake of 1.5 grams per kilogram per day. Again, eating a very high amount of calcium. You can see here that renal net acid excretion increased from control here, and they were actually in positive acid balance. As I covered before, the kidneys have a set capacity to eliminate acid before some is retained. This goes to show you that if you eat a fairly high animal protein diet, guess what? You can go into positive acid balance. Now, here are the calcium balances from the 4 individuals that increased their protein intake. This individual, subject number 4, went from a positive calcium balance of 2.3 millimoles per day to a negative calcium balance, despite consuming over 900 milligrams of calcium per day. Patient 5 remained in positive. Patient 6 went from negative to even more negative calcium balance. And patient 7 went from a significantly positive calcium balance to a slight positive calcium balance. So in patient 4, approximately 952 milligrams of calcium would be needed to remain in positive balance on this high protein diet. Patient 6 would need almost 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day to remain in positive balance, and patient 7 would need around 776 milligrams of calcium to remain in positive balance. In other words, yes, eating a high animal protein diet, again, as per this clinical study, can throw people from positive calcium balance to negative, even if they're consuming 908 milligrams of calcium per day. And some people may need almost 1,200 milligrams of calcium in a high animal protein diet to remain in positive calcium balance, hence supporting my notion again. Here's another study, the effects of dietary excesses in animal proteins and in sodium on the composition and crystallization kinetics of calcium oxalate monohydrate in urines of healthy men. Some just got the high protein, some got the high sodium, and then they also did studies on both combined. And as you can see here again, yes, on the high protein urinary calcium does significantly increase. Urinary citrate significantly decreases. Urinary uric acid significantly increases. So eating a high animal protein diet does increase the propensity for uric acid kidney stones to occur. This may not happen, but it may increase the propensity. And this is basically like if you are more dehydrated in a certain day and consuming more animal protein, those 2 factors may combine to potentially throw someone right into a kidney stone attack. But it may not, right? But it's just increasing the propensity. for doing so. This study was from Avery Ince, lowering dietary protein. Basically reduces urinary calcium excretion. Same things that we've already covered. This here, 39 healthy. Let me just go back here and see what this one is. Oh, this was where they reduced the protein intake from 1.1 grams per kilogram down to 0.8, and they did show that the urine pH increased as they reduced the protein. Net acid excretion decreased. Mean urinary calcium decreased as well, and bone resorption and telepeptide decreased significantly as well. Basically just showing that as you decrease renal net acid excretion, yes, calcium decreases in the urine, and bone resorption markers decrease as you decrease the acid load of the diet. Okay, so that was this publication here. And let's continue on. This is basically showing that this is in the different diets here. Even though it was just an extra 20 grams of protein, you can still have a significant increase in net acid excretion. Right, and here's the renal net acid excretion going down from the ad libitum intake of about 1.1 grams per kilogram of protein down to the RDA. Now, don't confuse this. I am not recommending, nor do I think it is good, to consume a low protein diet. The object really, and what I do, is I consume a high animal protein diet. I just offset it with base, because we know low protein diets aren't good for bone health. So you want to have a good protein intake. This is just showing you, though, that basically when you lower net acid excretion, it does still lower urinary calcium. This is basically just showing you that as the acid load of the diet goes up, urinary calcium does increase. Okay, just another study showing that, yes, the propensity for negative calcium balance does increase on a diet high in animal proteins if it is not offset with base. This is another study showing this similar things as well. The calciuria of increased fixed acid production. This is Nancy Adams. 7 healthy adults during control conditions and during increased fixed acid production. Oh, actually, I had already showed this previously. So I had already shown that one previously. So let's forgo that one. Okay, so this study on calcium metabolism, effects of low calcium and variable protein intake on human calcium metabolism. So this was comparing basically a moderate protein diet. They also did a really low protein diet, but I don't want to focus on that. And a high protein diet of 153.6 grams of protein. 6 healthy males consumed these diets that were low in calcium, 100 milligrams of calcium. Here's the subjects, basically very young, 22 to 32 years of age. And here's how they increase the acid load of the diet by adding turkey and beef. So this is the 12 grams of nitrogen versus the 24, which is the 76.8 grams of protein and the 153 grams of protein groups, respectively. As you can see here, comparing the 77 gram protein diet to the 153 gram protein diet, there was always significantly more calcium essentially coming out in the urine compared to the moderate protein. We know this. Calcium balance was negative in both because you're only consuming about 100 milligrams of calcium. But significant losses and a significant increased loss. This was 134 milligrams more coming out in the urine, of negative calcium balance further than the moderate protein. Yes, they did consume 20 milligrams less of calcium, which is that's expected on a high animal protein diet. It's going to be slightly less, right? 20 milligrams in each group. But look at how much more calcium balance was negative, much more than 20 milligrams. The calcium balance was consistently more negative, on average by 82 milligrams more for these subjects. So it goes to show you, again, this proves that in a high animal protein diet, as we had just said, by adding turkey and beef and going from 77 grams of protein to 153, leads to worse calcium balance than moderate. In other words, it does increase the propensity for negative calcium balance. Okay. So let's look at some more studies here. Okay, I'm going to go through this here as well. This is diet, acids, and alkalis influence calcium retention in bone. This is a 4-period double crossover study investigating whether a diet intervention specifically focused on acid load could modify calcium metabolism in humans. 8 healthy volunteers underwent a 4-day metabolic preparation with 2 types of diets, one rich in acid ash forming, one providing base-forming nutrients, including a bicarb-rich mineral water. This is what I believe we should be doing, adding some type of base, whether it be fruits, whether it be low oxalate fruits or vegetables if you tolerate those, or whether it be bicarbonate-rich mineral waters or bicarbonate or citrate supplements. I believe that will help offset the acid load. And that has been shown in many, many studies, actually. Giving alkaline supplements or increasing low oxalate fruits and vegetables will improve the calcium balance and will improve bone mass in doing so. Anyway, both of these diets contain similar contents of minerals. On the 4th day of the diet, a single oral dose of 1 gram of calcium was given, either as carbonate or gluconolactate. Cereal, blood, and urine samples revealed that the diet significantly affected blood pH. Some people argue that giving bicarbonate or giving an acid diet won't affect pH. This study shows that, yeah, the blood pH was significantly different compared from the acid-forming diet to the base-forming diet. In other words, yes, you can affect blood pH through the diet by giving by liberating either more protons from an acid diet or giving more bicarbonate from a more base-forming diet. And no shocker that urine pH also was significantly different in between the 2 diets. All right. The acid-forming diet increased urinary calcium excretion by 74% when compared to the base-forming diet. Both at baseline and after the oral calcium load, C telepeptide excretion significantly increased by 19%, suggesting a skeletal origin for the excess calcium output. This observation confirms that renally excreted acids derived from food influence calcium metabolism and that alkalizing nutrients inhibit bone resorption, something that I've been saying for a while. So the study followed a double crossover design extending over 4 weekly sessions. Each session began with a 3-day diet preparation followed by 1 day of investigation under the same diet, during which a single dose of 1 gram of oral calcium was administered. The subjects twice received each type of regimen, acidifying or alkalizing diet, once with each tested calcium salt. The sequence order was randomized according to a pre-established balanced list. The diet periods were separated by 3 days without 3 days washout with free food intake. So the first calcium preparation consisted in 2 chewable tablets of calcium carbonate, each containing half a gram of elemental calcium. So they got a full gram of elemental calcium. The other preparation was calcium gluconolactate, corresponding to 1 gram of elemental calcium. All meals were prepared from the same batches of ingredients whenever possible. The portions were carefully weighed and cooked without salt. Predetermined amounts of sodium chloride were given, blah, blah, blah. The meals were served at approximately 8 a.m., 9 a.m. on study days, 1 p.m. and 6 p.m. with additional afternoon and evening snacks. The volunteers had to eat completely each administered meal under the investigator supervision. Any other food was forbidden during the study periods. They also received 2 liters of mineral water to drink at regular intervals throughout the day. Here's just the differences in the diets, just showing you diet A was more acid forming. They had more beef, more cheese, more salmon, more turkey. And the B diet was more base forming, more potatoes, more fruits. And they had the bicarbonate alkaline rich mineral water. And here it's showing you it's not a super high protein diet, but it is showing you that the bicarb in the urine was significantly different. 400 milligrams in the urine of the acid-forming diet and 4,300 milligrams in the base-forming diet. So acid-forming diet, base-forming diet, even though it's only a moderate protein, you can still have significant differences in that. Calcium total was 1,704 milligrams, which undoubtedly 1,000 of that must have come in from the supplement, and 704 milligrams from dietary intake in the first 3 days, and then on day 4, they got the 1,000 milligrams. Same here, 888 milligrams of calcium from the diet, and 1,000 was added on day 4. And here's the daily excretions of calcium. As you can see, the acid-forming diet had basically 100, it's over 100 milligrams more, 108 milligrams more coming out in the urine of diet A, despite consuming significantly less calcium. So 704 milligrams of calcium in the diet, and a total of 1,700 when the 1 gram was given, versus 1,888 and 888 from the diet. And you can see here 108 more milligrams coming out in the urine despite eating less calcium. And here's the venous blood pH on the base-forming diet, which was significantly higher than the acid-forming diet, P equals 0.002. According to some people, this can happen because according to some people, based on a theory of Stewart, that liberating protons or giving bicarbonate is a dependent variable and hence cannot alter blood pH. Sorry to say, the clinical studies in humans would refute that statement. Urine pH on a base-forming diet was 7.5, showing you that it was more alkaline, because usually urine's going to be about 7. So this was, giving more base. And the acid-forming diet, urinary pH, about 6.5. And here's your calcium excretion increased by 70, I think it was 74%. Significantly more calcium being excreted on the acid-forming diet versus the base-forming diet, despite consuming less calcium. It's, in my opinion, there's a good chance that these individuals were in negative calcium balance. I can't say it for sure because they didn't look at stool. However, ingestion of 704 milligrams of calcium, you absorb approximately 30% of dietary calcium, which would mean about 211 milligrams was absorbed. But on the high acid diet, 259 milligrams was excreted. So likely these individuals were in negative calcium balance, but I cannot say that for sure. Regardless, this definitely suggests that that a high animal protein diet increases the propensity to go into negative calcium balance. Daily calcium excretion increased significantly. Here's the p-value by 74% versus the base-forming diet, despite, again, the acid-forming diet consuming less calcium. Moreover, a relative increase in the urinary output of C telepeptide was noted under acid-forming diet along with a hypercalciuric effect. Urinary C telepeptide is a reference marker of bone osteoclastic activity. Its increase under the acid-forming diet is thus a strong argument in favor of a skeletal origin of the excess urinary calcium and against a food effect on intestinal calcium absorption. The latter also seems unlikely since the increase in urinary and plasma calcium after an oral load of calcium was the same under both diets. Just another study suggesting increased bone breakdown on a high acid-forming diet. Okay. So let's look at another study. This is Kurtstetter. They evaluated 16 healthy young women on the effects of dietary protein on markers of bone turnover. The experiment was 2 weeks of a well-balanced diet containing moderate amounts of calcium, sodium, protein, followed by 4 days of an experimental diet containing one of 3 levels of protein, low, medium, or high. Urinary calcium excretion was significantly higher on the high than the low. Again, urinary N-telepeptide, which is a bone resorption marker, excretion was significantly greater during the high protein than the low protein. There was no increase in osteocalcin to offset this, which is the bone formation, or bone-specific alkaline phosphatase when compared the low to the high, suggesting that bone resorption was increased without a compensatory increase in bone formation. Our data suggests that a high level of dietary protein, at least a portion of the increase in urine calcium, reflects increased bone resorption. We've seen this several times now in human clinical studies. The details of the study design have been reported previously. The protocol included 3 cycles, each of which consisted of 2 weeks of an adjustment diet followed by 4 days of an experimental diet and 3 days of an ad libitum. During the adjustment period, subjects modified their usual intake to contain moderate amounts of protein, sodium, calcium, and caffeine. The next 4 days constituted the experimental period, during which the subjects received all of their food from the Yale General Clinical Research Center Metabolic Kitchen. The experimental diet was controlled in minerals while containing one of 3 levels of dietary protein, low, medium, or high. Fasting blood and urine samples were collected on the mornings of days 0 and 4 of each experimental period. The cycle of a 2-week adjustment period and a 4-day experimental period was repeated 2 more times until all subjects received each of the 3 levels of dietary protein in random order. During the 2-week adjustment period, subjects were instructed to self-select their diets containing approximately 1 gram of protein per kilogram. This amount of calcium, which is 800 milligrams, 20 millimoles times 40 milligrams per, which is the molecular weight of calcium, is 800 milligrams of calcium. During the 4-day experimental period, subjects reported daily to, and they had to receive their meals and record their body weights. All experimental diets consisted of a variety of common foods that were prepared, weighed, and served from the metabolic kitchen under the supervision of the research dietitian. The experimental diets were individually calculated for each subject to contain 1 of 3 levels of proteins, whereas other nutrients remained constant. Protein intake was 0.7 grams per kilogram in the low, 1 gram per kilogram in the medium, or 2.1 grams per kilogram in the high. The source of calcium in the experimental diets was primarily dairy foods and a commercially available chewable form of calcium carbonate. Okay, so they're giving these people a lot of calcium, hence the 800 milligrams of calcium. All right, so you can see here calcium 800 milligrams, which is 20 millimoles, and here's the protein, 45 grams, 63 grams, and 129 grams in the high protein intake. Poultry and fish were the primary source of protein in the high protein diet. You see here a significant increase in urinary calcium on day 4 and day 14. P-value is less than 0.0005. You can see here N-telepeptide also was significantly higher in the high protein than the low protein, which is a marker of bone resorption. Okay, so just another experiment showing significant increases in urinary calcium, which obviously would increase the propensity for negative calcium balance. Just another clinical study. I don't even know how many clinical studies we're on right now, but at least 5. This is another study by Breslau, relationship of animal protein-rich diet to kidney stone formation and calcium metabolism. 15 young normal subjects were studied during 3 12-day dietary periods during which their diet contained vegetable protein, vegetable and egg protein, or animal protein. As the fixed acid content of the diets increased, urinary calcium excretion increased from 103 milligrams per day on the vegetarian diet to 150 milligrams per day on the animal protein diet. There was a modest reduction of urinary cyclic AMP excretion and serum parathyroid hormone and 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, consistent with acid-induced bone dissolution. There was no change in fractional intestinal calcium absorption. The inability to compensate for the animal protein-induced calciuric response, aka saying the inability to absorb more calcium to offset the higher urinary calcium, may be a risk factor for developing osteoporosis. The animal protein diet, when its electrolyte composition and quantity of protein were kept the same as the vegetarian diet, conferred an increased risk for uric acid kidney stones. This is the composition of the animal protein and the ovo-vegetarian protein diets. Cheese in amounts necessary to achieve 400 milligrams of calcium per day were given, and they consumed beef, chicken, and fish, 2 or more servings. And the ovo-vegetarian was soybean milk and cheese in amounts to achieve that, 400 again, calcium. And they also, the study was conducted in 3 consecutive phases, the order of which was randomized by drawing lots. Each phase lasted 12 days. During each phase, the diet was kept constant with respect to calcium, 400 milligrams. Protein was provided as an animal protein during one phase and as a soy-based protein with eggs during the ovo-vegetarian. There was also a straight vegetarian diet as well, which you can see here. So calcium intake actually was above 400 milligrams in each group. In the animal diet, high animal protein diet, was 447 milligrams of calcium. And you can see here basically the same in the other 2 diets. Okay, so no shocker, net acid excretion increased as animal foods increased in the diet. pH in the urine decreased. That is expected. Urinary calcium significantly increased in the animal protein diet, and uric acid significantly increased. Now, they did not measure stool calcium content, but in the animal protein diet, they consumed 447 milligrams, which about 30% of that is bioavailable, which means they would have absorbed about 134 milligrams, yet they excreted 150 milligrams of calcium out in the urine. So it is very possible that these individuals were also in negative calcium balance. I can't say that for sure. What I can say is it definitely increases the propensity for negative calcium balance. Parathyroid hormone was significantly decreased. 24-hour urinary cyclic AMP was significantly decreased, and the 125-dihydroxyvitamin D was also significantly decreased on the animal protein diet. And then the undissociated uric acid was significantly increased. That here actually going from 13.2 on the vegetarian to 35.9 micromoles per liter. Here's what they said. Our results suggest that the major calciuric factor during animal protein ingestion is bone resorption in response to the acid load. Since there is no compensation for the bone resorptive urinary calcium losses that occur during high animal protein intakes, a negative calcium balance ensues. In addition to the hypercalciuria, the animal protein diet was associated with the greatest urinary excretion of uric acid. This is not surprising. In addition, the high acid ash content of the meat caused acidification of the urine, which raised the undissociated uric acid concentration. This urinary environment would favor precipitation of uric acid crystals and would represent a particular risk for patients with gouty kidney stones, uric acid kidney stones. A reduction in urinary citrate would be expected to enhance the crystallization of calcium oxalate and calcium phosphates, and citrate is an inhibitor of these crystallizations. I did receive a message from the wife of a carnivore male who, after 1 week of increasing base by drinking about 1 liter of bicarbonate mineral water and taking bicarbonate supplements that I had mentioned in my video, she had stated that his gout completely went away after he had been suffering with gout for many months, and his joint pain went away, and he was able to walk again. Now, I'm not saying this person was on a 100% carnivore diet, nor do I want to say that animal foods definitively cause that. All I am saying is someone's wife who stated that they were trying to follow a carnivore diet, and let's assume that they weren't fully following it, did have improvements by adding base. So even if, let's say, you're on a animal-based diet, not fully carnivore, there may be benefits. This can't prove causation, but it was interesting that I received that message. Okay, so I want to kind of get away from the clinicals. I've covered many that prove my point, but I kind of want to actually cover some interesting things regarding the Inuit. So there's been a couple studies published on the Alaskan Inuit, aka back in the 70s they called them Eskimos. It's not really appropriate to say that, but that's what happened. That's the terms they used back in the 70s. So this was a study of direct photon absorbed geometry was used to measure bone mineral content of the forearm bones in Eskimo natives of the north coast of Alaska. Okay, I'm going to show you how we know that some of these individuals, most, if not all, were consuming their traditional diet. I will show you that later. But the sample consisted of 217 children, 89 adults, and 107 elderly over 50 years of age. So we had 170 people over 50, 89 adults, and that were obviously not over 50, and then 217 children. So pretty large sample size. You're talking, I don't know, about 400 people, it looks like. Eskimo children had a lower bone mineral content than the United States whites by about 5 to 10%, but that was consistent with their smaller body and bone size. Young Eskimo adults of both sexes were similar to whites, but after the age of 40, the Eskimos of both sexes had a deficit of 10 to 15% relative to white standards. Aging bone loss, which occurs in many populations, has an earlier onset and greater intensity in the Eskimos, which we know consume a high animal protein diet. Nutritional factors of high protein, high nitrogen, high phosphorus, and low calcium may be implicated. Okay, so in 1970, additional subjects were measured in Point Hope and Point Barrow. Measurements were made on the radius and ulna shaft and also on the distal radius and ulna. Each subject, an average of approximately 4 determinations were taken, okay, to get the bone mineral density, bone mineral content. Now, how do we know that these people, these Eskimos of Point Hope in 1970 were consuming a traditional diet? Well, I published about this. This is my paper, Markedly Increased Intake of Refined Carbs and Sugar is Associated with the Rise of Coronary Heart Disease and Diabetes. Yes, that happened, but it didn't happen in the early 70s in the Point Hope Inuit. And I'm going to show you this. This is a screenshot from my publication. In 1972, Dr. Sheldon A. Feldman, MD, and colleagues, who lived with the Inuit, by the way, published a study on the Inuit living on Alaska's North Slope, Point Hope. During the early 1970s, the Eskimos of Point Hope, known as the Tagara people, were one of the few Inuit villages that still subsisted on whale and seal meat and blubber. Only 2 other villages at the time along Alaska's North Slope continued the traditional hunting of whales using harpoons during the spring months. In the spring and early summer, these North Slope Alaskan Inuit mainly relied on catching and eating seals, walrus, and fish. In the summer, the main dietary staple was caribou, and in winter, they would occasionally catch and eat polar bear. The consumption of grains and other carbohydrates was low due to the high cost of their import. This is from my publication here on the caloric intake of the Point Hope Inuit, published by Feldman in 1972. About 3,000 calories. Carb intake was less than or equal to 10%. Sugar intake was less than 30 grams per day. They noted grain products were scarce, and while sucrose was not unknown, the average adult ingested less than 30 grams a day of sucrose. Okay, so we know that these individuals that were included in the study that I'm about to show you the details on, at least the Point Hope Inuit, this is in 1970, and this was published in 1972 on Feldman, showing that they were mainly consuming a diet high in animal foods, low in grains and other carbs, as I had said. So what happened? During the decade from 40 to 49 in these Point Hope and also Point Barrow, Eskimo, they had 10% lower values than the U.S. whites, and the deficit increased to 14% in the succeeding 2 decades. During their 70s, the Eskimo males were 15% below whites, and Eskimo females were almost 30% below. Okay. In whites, it has been shown that a radius shaft bone mineral value of 60 milligrams per centimeter discriminates between normals and osteoporotic females. Interestingly, white females tend to have a plateau in their bone loss at approximately this value during their 70s. Eskimo women reach this state of demineralization during their 60s, a full decade earlier than white females. And the Eskimo showed no evidence of a plateau in bone loss, so that in the 70s, demineralization continued to even greater levels. 60% of Eskimo women over the age of 60 would be classified in the population at risk of fracture by the above criterion, and by age 70, virtually all Eskimo women were in this class. Studies on the bones of modern Eskimo archaeologic populations, the Sadler Mewat Eskimo from Southampton Island at the northern border of the Hudson Bay, have indicated that the Sadler Mewat had normal bone composition, that the densities of bones and of whole bones were comparable to those of the white population. However, the older group of the Sadler Mewat, over 35, both male and female had almost 10 to 50% lower bone weights and densities than the young adults. This is a striking concordance with the present results of living Eskimos. Interestingly, the studies of MERBs on the Sadler Mewat skeletal pathology, these are Inuit as well, have indicated that there was a high incidence of vertebral compression fractures. Recent investigations have indicated that density of long bones was correlated with number and severity of compression fractures in the Sadler Mewat. The extensive aging, bone loss in contemporary Eskimos may also be correlated with bone pathology, including fractures and tooth loss. As Eskimo longevity increases, it is possible that skeletal pathology as a result of demineralization could present public health problems. The most obvious factor in the 2 to 3% higher rate of bone loss in middle-aged Eskimos would be their meat diet. Several studies have indicated that young animals develop bone demineralization on meat diets. Now, I am going to show you another report of Wainwright Inuit. Now, here's Point Hope that we know were consuming their traditional diet. This is the northern slope of Alaska. It's more, since it's more northern, it is basically more on the outskirts, more likely that these individuals are consuming their typical traditional diet because it's further away from civilization. So here's Point Hope, which we know from Feldman were consuming their traditional diet. Wainwright is even further north, even more remote than Point Hope. And then Point Barrow, which was also from the study I just covered, is even more remote than Wainwright, even further north than Wainwright. Here's Wainwright. So the previous study showing Point Hope, which we know documented from Feldman, they consume their traditional diet primarily, very low carb. Very likely that Point Barrow as well, which is the most remote out of these three areas, was also consuming a diet very high in their traditional diet. So it's very likely that these results are on a traditional Inuit diet, that yes, their bone mineral density is significantly lower, and that they would be classified more as osteoporotic. Now, this is a preliminary report from the Wainwright Inuit, so even more north than the Point Hope. Direct photon absorptiometry was developed, and it has been shown to have an accurate and precise method for measurement of bones. So they did this, they used this novel radiological method during the summers of 68 and 69 in Eskimo inhabitants of Wainwright, Alaska, which again is more remote than even Point Hope, to determine bone mineralization. And here's what they concluded. Elderly Eskimos, both male and female, showed a remarkably lower bone mineral content than compared to U.S. whites. This decrease would be sufficient to classify most Eskimo women over the age of 40 as osteoporotic and subject to the risk of fracture. This excessive loss of bone could be associated with a highly acid diet of the Eskimo combined with the typical renal problems of the elderly. But as yet, there is no clear basis for hypothesis. It's a hypothesis. So the clinical studies that I just covered clearly show that the propensity for negative calcium balance is increased on a high animal protein diet, and that, in my opinion, you should offset that with base. And then looking at Eskimos who likely are consuming a traditional diet seem to have a higher decrease in bone mineral density and risk for osteoporosis.